Hi athletes, parents, coaches, athletic directors, administrators, whoever's coming back in to join us and dig a little deeper into concepts around anti-fragility and how they show up in sports performance scenarios. Up until this point, we have spent at least part of the episode digging a little bit into the science or the core components for each topic that we covered. And just want to give you all a heads up that we're going to shift that a little bit going forward. All of that science, the studies, some of the research, right, and the implications can be found in our core playlist and core podcast on anti-fragility. When we get into these, we're really going to keep it specific to that scenario itself. So in this case, and for you all, that is, as we said, sports performance. So if you want to kind of dig into some of the nerdy stuff and the science, better understand, make sure to check out that video as well. That said, let's go ahead and jump right into things. So we just finished recording the episode talking about what a mindset is, how we think about an anti-fragile mindset, and how that's really made up of, let's say, 4 or 5, maybe 6 different mindsets or sub-mindsets. So we'll spend this time, Adam, just talking about, I think in your experience and my experience, where and how and what some of the implications are of these different mindsets that show up. And so what that means is we'll cover really kind of 5 or 6 core mindsets here. That starts with the difference between a challenge or opportunity versus a threat mindset. Right? Again, challenge or opportunity versus threat. Growth versus fixed. Process versus outcome. Tend and befriend versus sort of isolate, right? Or freeze, run, right, fear, those sorts of base, like loneliness-based sort of ideas. And then kind of more generally, both and versus either or mindsets or types of thinking, right? So out of that list, Adam, any kind of low-hanging fruit that you think just kind of stands out and in your work with the Nationals or, you know, really across all, I think whatever it is, 16 sports, that you feel like you have to tend to the most when it comes to mindset work?
It's challenge versus threat.
Okay.
Because when you look at threat, what's important to see, it's not simply a threat to your career or a threat to your performance. At a conscious level, when we look at threat, it's a threat to your sense of self. Like effectively what you're worried about is a part of you dying, whether it's at your perception of self or what your parents think of you or your friends think of you or the greater public thinks of you. There's a potential loss of self at stake here. So while it seems like, oh, that's just a performance, it's much deeper and much more existential, and that's how it's experienced, and that's why it's so overwhelming when one experiences that kind of emotional, the emotional impact of feeling that anything is a threat to our well-being.
And so just maybe in a single sentence, just remind people why that is. Like, what's the core difference between a challenge or opportunity and a threat mindset?
Well, the idea is if it's a challenge, it's an opportunity to grow, learn,
Okay.
succeed, right? And a threat's just the opposite. It's overwhelming. It's something that's seen beyond our control. Effectively, metaphorically, it's something that's going to kill a part of us.
Yeah. And so in your world, there is a real reality between, listen, I would like for you to physiologically and psychologically maybe loosen the grip a little bit, right? And focus on this being a challenge and an opportunity to learn and grow versus them looking at it and saying, yeah, but, you know, Dr. Adam, this is an actual threat because I could be out of the league. I could be sent back down, right? Like there could be all sorts of implications here. And the threat of that loss, especially if it's tied to identity, which we've talked about in other episodes and why that's so problematic, right? That is, I think it sounds like for many of your athletes, like a very real and visceral thing. So how do you help them navigate something like that?
The most important part to this is that the defense mechanism that people use often is denial. They try to run from it. They try to avoid it.
Give me an example.
Don't recognize. I'm a pitcher. I just got called up, and recognizing that if you don't pitch well today, you're not going to stay in the major leagues for but one day. And that's real. Now, you could say it's just another game. Yeah, it's just another game at Citi Field with 40,000 people watching you, right? And guess what? That suppression, it's going to rear its ugly head somewhere physiologically in terms of tension, right? If that tension is not expressed somehow in a conscious way, you're going to be a little too rigid, a little too tight, a little too quick. You know, it's going to impact your performance and consequently your overall sense of self.
Yeah, okay, perfect. How about like a mastery mindset or a process versus outcome mindset?
Yeah, I'm just going to give you an aside. I just was talking to a client today, and they were upset because they had a couple A minuses and they didn't get A pluses. And in my response, it's like the pursuit of excellence is a worthy pursuit, but attaching yourself to the outcome is perfectionism. And while it can be adaptive in times, it's always the pursuit of perfectionism. It becomes very maladaptive when you actually think it's something you're ever going to achieve or hold on to. And part of that process orientation is that, yes, we want to work toward excellence in every way we can, but the idea is not about the outcome itself. It's about the marginal gains in the process of trying to achieve the outcome.
And I think a really, really critical piece here, and you say it very well all the time, just like you said this bit, is it doesn't mean outcome can't be important, right? It doesn't preclude that you only care about the process and participation trophies and, Giannis Antetokounmpo, like there's no such thing as failure. Like these things can coexist. All we're saying is like recognize outcome is very rarely, if ever, totally under our control. Process, right, we have a lot more control over. And so the mindset and the idea that I can do what I can do to the extent I can do it, and then some of beyond that is not under my control. That's the separation. I'm also thinking of Amy Edmondson, right? The difference between mistakes and intelligent failure. If it is under your control and you're still not performing, or there's still, right, something getting in the way of the end result that you want, well, then that's a different problem that we got to address, and that's still good data to have. It's just keeping in mind, when it comes to a mastery mindset, some things are out of your control. Focus on the process, grow incrementally.
Yes to all that. And I think the outcome part is really important, particularly where you're working in the world of high stakes, right? Working at the razor's edge, analytics matter. Not only does it matter in terms of whether or not you're going to have your job, it could mean whether or not you're going to live or die. But what's important about the outcome is we take a curious approach that it's providing data for the opportunity to course correct. But we don't attach to it in such a way that we get focused rigidly on what happened, because if that happens, we're not in the present moment and we can't react to what's in front of us. We can't move forward.
Yeah. I'll just add too, the irony here, of course, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, just given your position with the Nationals, is like in some cases, in some studies, process goals actually lead to better performance outcomes, especially with athletes, right? So it's, and I think.
Yeah, go ahead. That's great. Go ahead, finish your thought.
No, I was going to throw it to you. Like I was just going to say, I imagine you have probably seen this show up in your work.
In the most simplistic way, you do what arguably the hardest thing in sport is hitting a baseball, right? Traveling 95 plus miles per hour, because effectively you're blind. You're not seeing the ball when it hits the bat. And somebody's 0 for 25. The worst thing to do is go up there trying to get a hit. Right? It's the worst thing you do, because what happens is your attentional focus is on everything but following the ball and letting your unconscious processes take over, which is deeper in the subcortical structures, right, in your cerebellum, as opposed to the cortical structures being lit up, searching for answers, trying too hard, right? This idea of a flow state, obviously, but the whole point in trying to teach someone is like your ability to let go is really essential. And it's not letting go of your skill set, it's let going of your attachment to the outcome.
I don't want to get too sports tangential here, but I just found that I spent over the weekend at the PGA Championship in Louisville, and this was something I found myself thinking about a lot, because as somebody who's enjoyed that sport for a long time, that was my first live event. I was really taken aback by how slow and smooth every swing was in real life. And I know you've worked with quite a few golfers, and I don't know if you had, and I don't think you play, but I don't know if you have the same reaction, because on TV it looks quite quick. It's sped up, right? And I think everything you just described is perfect, that when you focus on, and golf is such a good example, because a golf swing is just process over and over and over, right? When you focus on that process and detach yourself from that outcome, there is a fluidity, a flowiness, not a rigidity, a grippiness that comes with sort of, grip it and rip it and hit 400-yard drives and sort of thing. There's a smoothness that I think just is represented really well by that sport, similarly to baseball.
We call it a fluid execution, right? It's a fluid motor execution, right? And in that sense, it's like same with baseball. The idea is, if you're searching for a quality at bat, it has nothing to do with the outcome. It has nothing to do with did you get a hit or not. right? Did you see the ball and you put a good swing on it? And same thing in golf. The idea is just a fluid execution of the swing as if the ball's not there, ironically, right? You're not trying to hit the ball. You're trying to put a
Right.
good swing on it. Yeah.
Right.
So I think why sport is good, because metaphorically I think it works so well and transfers to so many aspects. But I think we all have some experience with that kind of motor acquisition and motor execution. And I think it's a good way, if we could take that, we could apply it to all aspects of our life, from academics and work outcomes and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, so our last couple of mindsets, like kind of tend and befriend, that sort of social support, social giving, altruistic generativity mindset, but also just kind of the basics of a growth versus fix mindset, right? Do you see that showing up a lot? Not just in professional athletics, but again, as we've covered in other episodes, you're also a father watching a young person experience this as well. Growth versus fix, the social piece, either of those stand out to you?
It stands out a lot. It's a good point, particularly in looking at youth sport and unfortunately, how some coaches approach their athletes at a younger age developmentally, as if talent is fixed, particularly at a young age, as opposed it's not their role to develop talent over a period of time. And that and ultimately then ends up being a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, I'm really, really glad you brought that up, and I didn't necessarily think about going there. I'm so glad that you did. And I know there's problems with this research, but the concept in psychology is a Pygmalion effect, right? Like the idea here, we've been talking about mindsets as if they are just something that happens within an individual, right? And the individual can control them or not. But the reality is that our mindsets are often adopted by the experiences or the mindsets of the people that, kind of surround us, right? And so this idea that can then become a self-fulfilling prophecy, again, you've got to pay attention to who you're surrounding yourself with and how their talk, communication, feedback, their expectations shift yours as well.
Mm-hmm. I see too many kids walk away from a sport at an early age. Most kids walk away at 13, something like 70% plus. And I think it's largely because of this perspective that coaches ultimately inject into their athletes.
So let's use that to dig in a little bit. So give people, again, just a sentence or two reminder, difference between growth and fixed and how that might show up in coaching.
So the idea is very simple. It's growth mindset is that talent can be developed through effort and learning. Right? And no one knows, but here's a perfect example. I remember seeing a study in high-level soccer, professional soccer. What percentage of, I think it was 17U players, will actually make it at 25 to the highest level of professional soccer? And basically, it was like close to zero. So what it's telling me is the best soccer coaches in the world can't effectively identify talent, even at 17 years old. Let alone there are people that think at 7 they know if somebody's talented or not and they can project their future. It's absurd. It's irrational, right? But this is what happens often in youth sport today. And it's unfortunate, and it's something that I think we have to really make a point to teach the science around this so we don't fall victim to it. And if we're parents, we can be advocates for our children and find clubs and academies and institutions that support growth.
And again, and we talked about this in the kind of core episode, that's not necessarily at the exclusion of caring about outcomes, right? And again, this doesn't necessarily need to be an either or. There's potentially some both and here, but the critical nature of, and we've already covered, right, kind of process versus outcome, mastery. So kind of there's such connectivity with growth and fix, the critical nature of the life lesson of understanding that feedback can be a good thing, criticism can be a good thing, having to put in more effort doesn't necessarily mean you're not capable, it just means it might be harder and it's a challenge to overcome. And we've got lots of research that says that shit's more rewarding. That's a good thing, right, in many cases, as we've talked about in other episodes. So, aside from just the way it can help performance in sport, right? Ironically, to be focused on growth instead of just the outcome, we think all these things are generally like good life lessons for any time adversity strikes or performance matters.
If you frame outcomes as KPIs, as key performance indicators, it helps us course correct in terms of what do we need to work on to get better. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't define ourselves, nor does it define a ceiling of our potential.
That's right. Yep. That's right. Good. We'll get into that a little bit more, I think, much later in the series when we talk a little bit about identity for habits versus identity and goals, right? The key distinction there, because habits are processes and goals are outcomes. Really similar, I think, kind of symmetrical to the conversation we're having here, but that's for another later time. So, all right, so there's just a little bit on, again, the different types of mindsets at play, how those will often show up in sports and athletics. Again, if you want to take a deeper dive, dig in, nerd out a little bit more on the science itself, which we certainly recommend you do. We're just separating them so that you can get what you need as effectively and efficiently as possible. Then make sure and go out and check kind of core component 3, which is optimizing mindsets in the core playlist here.